Hi, my name is John Giles, and I'm an accessibility product manager at Workday.
And my name is William Stanton. I'm a senior accessibility product manager at Workday. And today, John and I are really excited to be presenting another topic in our Workday Accessibility Level Up series. If you're new to the series, each month we discuss a new topic in digital accessibility, ranging from anything from understanding guidelines to accessibility in design and to technical developer topics. Our goal is to have a little bit of something for everyone. And if you've missed any of our previous sessions, don't worry about it. They'll be recorded and available online for free. During our very first session, we focused on understanding what is accessibility and why it is critical to your organization. And during our most recent session, we focused on understanding disability and building empathy for others.
One of the most interesting things to me when talking to other accessibility professionals is that we all seem to have a unique story about how we got started with accessibility. So, hey, William, how did you get started with accessibility?
I'm glad you asked. I sort of accidentally stumbled into it, if I'm completely honest. I began my career as an assistive technology specialist at a small nonprofit based in Oakland, California, where I worked with people with disabilities, teaching computer literacy and job readiness skills. After that, I took an opportunity to work for an accessibility consulting agency, where my clients would hire me to perform accessibility audits, produce remediation plans, and write conformance reports. And then after that, 3 years later, I found my way to the Workday accessibility team. What about you, John?
Well, I come from a developer background, and I got thrown into the world of accessibility kind of unexpectedly one day. So before I joined Workday, my dev team, we got called into a meeting unexpectedly with one of the company vice presidents, and we all came to the conference room and sat down, and he looked at us across the table and said, "Several of our customers have been asking us about accessibility. What do we do for that?" And my team, we all kind of looked at each other, and there was a moment of awkward silence, and we said, "Well, not much. To be honest, we don't know much about it." And he listened patiently and said, "Well, our customers are asking us about accessibility. It's important for them, and it's important for us and who we want to be as a company. So we need to start doing it now. Just start doing accessibility." If only it were that easy, right?
Only if.
So we don't know your story. Maybe it's similar or very different from ours, but regardless of what your specific situation may have been, it can be difficult to know where to begin to do accessibility. Where do you start? As you start to investigate what it takes to do accessibility, it can quickly get overwhelming. It can seem like a pretty steep mountain to overcome. And why is that? Well, first of all, the stakes, they can be pretty high. You may ask yourself, if I don't do this right, will we get sued? Will there be legal ramifications? Will I lose my job? Will it hurt our company? Well, historically, there have been several high-profile lawsuits related to accessibility, so this can be a very real fear. Another question you might ask is, if I don't do this right, am I excluding people with disabilities? And most of us, we don't want to exclude people with disabilities, especially with the products we're creating. The products we're working on are made to address a specific need in most cases, to make life easier in some way. We want them to be used and enjoyed by everyone, so we don't want to create barriers. Secondly, as you start to learn about what it takes to do accessibility, you will quickly discover that it's just complicated. You may find yourself saying, "I never learned this." It was true for me. I know in my developer training, the only accessibility we covered was alt text for images, and even that was glossed over. Fortunately, this is changing, but traditionally it has not been emphasized in code schools and training programs, and as a result, many of us are just flat out unprepared. You'll also discover a whole alphabet soup of technical guidelines. There's WCAG, Section 508, EN 301-549, ATAG, and ARIA. These are very technical and can be difficult to understand at first glance. Then you may discover that accessibility experts have different opinions on how to meet these guidelines. And then how do you know if the product you're building is even usable when UX researchers aren't including people with disabilities in their work? Then there are best practices that go beyond the guidelines themselves. There are mobile considerations and all the different kinds of assistive technology, screen readers, switch devices, voice command software, etc. It's a lot. And then as you're sifting through all of this, you may come to the realization that I need to rethink how I do my job. But William and I, we're here to encourage you today that you don't need to do all of this perfectly in order to start doing accessibility. A mistake we can make is to think that we need to tackle this entire mountain of stuff all at once. But realistically, we don't need to do that to start making an impact. You don't need to understand everything and get it all perfectly just to get started. Merle Evans is a speaker, trainer, and author, and accessibility consultant, and she says the following: when it comes to accessibility, I encourage focusing on progress rather than perfection. Take that first step. No matter how small it is, it's a step forward. Don't wait until you get the website, product, or whatever it is just right. So at Workday, the accessibility team, we've embraced the motto progress over perfection. And just like any area of life, perfection is an illusion, and we want our focus to be on making steady progress towards delivering more accessible HR software. We want everyone to be able to read their pay slips, choose their benefits, and my personal favorite, request time off. So the goal of today's session is to help you look beyond that overwhelming mountain and to give you some practical suggestions on things that you can do to take that first step, start making progress, and start building some accessibility momentum in your role. We'll cover some ideas for product managers, UX designers, front-end web developers, and wrap up with some thoughts for functional testers and QA. All right, let's begin by talking about the role of a product manager.
A product manager should understand that delivering an accessible product must be a team effort, and expecting one member of a team to take on all of the accessibility work isn't going to set you up for success. The most important thing for a product manager is to focus on delivering value to your users. And as John mentioned in our introduction, it's very easy to get caught up in the fear of litigation, to be overwhelmed by the highly technical and confusing guidelines, or to simply be buried under the sheer number of issues found in a recent audit. A product manager needs to learn that some accessibility issues are far more severe than other accessibility issues. Just like everything else in product development, accessibility needs to be iterative and it needs to be focused on delivering value. Plan and organize the work to be done with accessibility in mind by setting multiple checkpoints along the way. For example, identify any risks to accessibility as early as you can. Repeatedly check in on accessibility during iterative design reviews. Incorporate accessibility into your product requirements and acceptance criteria in your developer stories. Check in again on accessibility during code reviews. And then finally, integrate accessibility into your testing and QA processes. When writing acceptance criteria for your project, the language that you use matters. Consider commonly used terms like clicking and hovering might accidentally cause your team to exclude people who won't be clicking and hovering on your product. Let's go over an example to see what I mean. Take this example of an acceptance criteria, a very simple and straightforward acceptance criteria. Quote, open a text field with the name of the job title, pre-filled when the user clicks on the pencil icon. As an accessibility professional, I have a few questions. My first question is, doesn't that text field need a label? And what should the label be? We should probably be specifying the text field has a label of, maybe it makes sense to be a job title. My second question is, how is this interaction going to work if I use my keyboard instead of a mouse or trackpad? We should probably be specifying that the pencil icon is a button, and buttons can receive focus with the keyboard, and users can press that button with either the Enter key or the spacebar on their keyboards. We might even also want to consider setting keyboard focus back to that text field after a user presses the pencil icon. And finally, this brings me to my last question. What's up with the pencil icon? Is that really how we want to be describing this to a screen reader user? What is the text alternative? Maybe it makes sense to describe this as an edit button. But I have another question. Are there multiple pencil icons repeated on this screen? And do we need to be more specific than edit button? Maybe it needs to be edit job title. So these are some examples of how I work with product managers to tease out a lot of these accessibility details before any development work has even started yet. A UX designer stands to benefit quite a lot from a content design exercise we refer to internally as an intent framing exercise. During this exercise, a designer focuses entirely on designing with words only, for the purposes of using language to capture the intended goal of the design. This exercise can then be used later to inform future decisions about the visuals of the UI and the interactions on the UI. Another key skill for a UX designer is to understand the color contrast requirements set in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. A designer should understand that working within these constraints in order to meet the needs of colorblind and low vision users first doesn't necessarily constrain them from adding in their own creative flair for everyone else. As an accessibility professional, I have observed that many accessibility issues are born out of the way UX designers are communicating with their engineering partners. Like any good architectural diagram, a high-fidelity design specification should have its own set of annotations specifically for accessibility. Designers can clearly communicate and specify what are the heading texts on the design, and specify other things like lists, tables, column headers, and much more. What about text alternatives for a design? Well, the intent framing exercise that I referred to earlier probably already contains the text alternatives that you need in your design. So designing with content first is secretly, covertly, doing accessibility first. If you'd like to learn more about this topic of designing with accessibility in mind, stay tuned to this series because we have additional deeper dives scheduled for later this year.
A front-end developer must understand that accessibility depends on an entire stack of software working together. Let me explain what I mean. Users with disabilities use assistive technology to access content on their devices. Assistive technology is a broad category, and screen readers are probably the most common example. Once again, stay tuned into this series and we will be focusing on a deeper introduction to assistive technology soon. The assistive technology works by sending and receiving information through the operating system's accessibility API. The web browser is exposing information about your web application to the operating system accessibility API with the accessibility tree, a simplified subset of the browser's document object model, or DOM for short. The key takeaway is a front-end developer only has domain control over one of these layers, and that is the browser's DOM of the web application. This is ultimately the user interface for someone depending on assistive technology. That's why an expert-level core competency in semantic HTML and how markup is relevant to an accessible experience will set you apart from other front-end developers. Progressive enhancement begins with a base foundation of semantic HTML, which is a core web technology that everyone can rely on. Dynamic interactions and cosmetic styling is then built on top of that. And ARIA, short for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, can be applied to augment and enhance the UI for screen readers as needed. ARIA is a highly advanced technical topic that we won't have time to unravel today, but please carefully consult the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide published by the Web Accessibility Initiative of the W3C and thoroughly understand the best practices first. And remember, no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. One of the most common questions we get from developers is, do I need an ARIA label here? And in most cases, the answer is no, and let me explain what I mean. A front-end developer must get acquainted with the accessible name and description computation. This is a standardized recursive algorithm set by the W3C that browsers must use for determining how a web element is to be described by assistive technology. In this simplified breakdown, the ARIA naming techniques with ARIA labeled by and ARIA label are very powerful, taking the highest precedence over all other naming techniques. This should be used with care and intention. It's often better to just use the semantic HTML labeled element, the image alt text attributes, or an element's inner text. Relying on browser fallbacks like the title attribute and placeholder values should be avoided. As we can see in this screenshot of the accessibility tree, this button has an unnecessary ARIA label. It does not need an ARIA label at all because the button text itself already says request time off. Any ARIA label text will be announced by the screen reader instead of the element's inner text. This can cause problems if the button language should ever need to be updated.
probably the easiest way to get started with accessibility testing is to simply put your mouse away. Try using your keyboard alone to complete the scenarios in your product and see what happens. While you're testing the responsiveness of your product, we recommend that you set your browser's width to 1,280 pixels wide and setting the browser zoom function to 400%. Here, you'll want to be examining the text for any clipping or overlapping effects, and keeping an eye out for any horizontal scrolling that isn't necessary in your product. You'll also be able to tell pretty quickly if any sticky headers or footers are taking up too much screen real estate and might be hindering any low vision users that are relying on these increased zoom functions. Functional testers may want to consider evaluating colors and contrast for accessibility as well, especially if the team doesn't have dedicated UX design resources in smaller organizations. Automation tests may never be able to reach 100% of all of the accessibility issues in your product or feature. However, they are still extremely useful for scaling your testing processes up and across multiple organizations. Unit tests integrated directly into the developer's pipeline are great for validating HTML markup and ensuring that ARIA roles, states, and properties are being applied correctly. Manually running browser extensions can also be useful for the same purpose of validating HTML and ensuring ARIA is used correctly. And finally, end-to-end function tests are great to verify the keyboard accessibility of your components and the focus order of the components on your design. Screen readers make excellent testing tools, and building up a basic level of competency using a screen reader is probably the ultimate way to kick the tires on all of your hard work. At Workday, we use 3 of the most popular screen readers in our testing strategy. First is NVDA. This is short for Non-Visual Desktop Access. This is an open source project supported by a community of developers. Second screen reader we use is called JAWS. This is short for Job Access with Speech. And this is a proprietary screen reader that requires the purchase of a license. And finally, VoiceOver is produced by Apple and comes included on all of Apple's products, even my Apple Watch. It's kind of amazing. Stay tuned to this series. We will be discussing these screen readers and other assistive technologies in greater depth very soon.
Thanks, William. To wrap up this session, we want to leave you with this quote by Gil Pencina, an American businessman who worked for Wikia Inc. and eBay. Momentum begets momentum, and the best way to start is to start. We hope today's session gave you some practical suggestions so that you can start to build some of that momentum. Yes, accessibility is complicated, and yes, there's a lot to learn, but we want to encourage you to just take that first step. Start making progress, and stay tuned for future Level Up sessions where we will go into more depth on many of the topics we touched on today.